How are you?
I'm good, sir. And you?
Let us wait for another 1 minute and thereafter we will start.
Okay, sir.
Today, I propose a new topic. Well, I welcome you all with a very warm good morning. As I was saying to Mr. Huck, that today we are going to have a very, very important engagement at regional level. We will try to understand, my dear friends, what kind of a protection shield, safeguards, and guarantees which are available to refugees at regional level. How international law has influenced regional understandings of protection of refugees. There are various regions, and we can say that some of the regional refugee protection instruments have really established their credentials and they are moving in the right direction. Some of the regional instruments and regional understandings with regard to the mechanisms or devising mechanisms for the protection of refugees are at their initial stages. Some of the instruments are evolving. Other instruments happens to be in their infancy. But cumulatively speaking, we have to understand what exactly are the programs, plans, actions, mechanisms available for the protection of refugees in Europe, in inter-American system of human rights, in Asian system of human rights, in Arab systems or Arab specific mechanisms for the protection of human rights, Afro-Asian and particularly Africa as a continent, how it has been contributing for the protection of human rights. Therefore, in this particular engagement, my dear friends, we are going to understand regional refugee protection and forced migration frameworks. In this particular engagement, my dear friends, we have to understand European Union dimensions of refugee law, as Europe has emerged as one of the most important talking point with regard to the protection of refugees. Many scholars have been addressing refugee crisis in Europe. Some of the scholars are of the view that it is not the refugee crisis in Europe, but it is the crisis of Europe. It is having some kind of a political transformations and political overtones. We have to understand the different treaty mechanisms and what has been the journey of the European Union in evolving a collection of laws designed for the protection of refugees in this particular continent. And there are certain important conventions at European level which ultimately have been facilitating and even in the past have facilitated the protection of refugees. the concept of Europe, we must, try to understand legal and policy, framework for refugee protection and forced migration in this particular part of the world. The European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms becomes very, very important in understanding these dimensions of protection. Then the European Union law and EU acquis. I will explain it, sir, at the subsequent what we call stage. And the European integration and asylum, European refugee protection, and other important, mechanisms which we generally find in the Dublin system that has exclusively been designed for the protection of, refugees in this part of the world. Then we have to understand, my dear friends, the African system of the refugee protection, particularly 1969 OAU Convention, governing the specific aspects of refugees. We have to understand 1984 Cartagena Declaration that is exclusively meant for the protection of refugees in Latin American nation states. And then we have to understand, my dear friends, the contemporary alternative refugee definitions which have been carried, which have been what you call formulated and crafted in many of the regional mechanisms. And we have to understand, and we have to evolve our understanding with regard to the or understanding the comparative refugee law and policy in Europe, Africa, Arab, and we have to understand what exactly are the frameworks which are necessary to understand all these dimensions. So therefore we have to, and let me make a presentation before you, my dear friends, for your consideration, a consolidated core text and instruments which are there in the public domain to understand how regional protection of refugees has evolved, emerged, adopted, concluded, and how it has been put into practice. So this is what we have to deliberate in this particular engagement, and this reminds me of a very, very important framework, and that is 1990 Convention on the Application of the Schengen Agreement. That should also be understood, though the initial treaty that was entered into force, and that is the 1985, my dear friends, the Schengen Treaty in Europe, and that ultimately paved the way for the political integration or regional integration of various nation states in the European continent. Then there is another important framework which is known as the 1990 Dublin Convention, determining the state responsibility or the state responsible for examining applications for asylum lodged in one of the member states of the European communities. Then the Cartagena Declaration, then the discussion document of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, particularly in relation to the refugee situation in Latin America, protection and solutions based on the what we call pragmatic approach of the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees. Then we have to understand the EU conclusion, particularly on countries in which there is generally no serious risk of persecution. Then again, European Union London resolution becomes very, very important on harmonized approach to questions concerning host third countries, particularly in the context of the refugee protection in Europe. Then we have to understand European Council directives. There are a number of directives on different what we call aspects and different context of the refugee protection. Then again, we have to understand, my dear friends, another important regional mechanisms that is which I have just mentioned, and that is 1969 African what you call or OAU Convention on the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. Then we have to understand the preliminary text, particularly relating to what you call the UNHCR, and that is chapter 2 of defending refugee rights. And particularly there are certain important chapters, as many as around what we call 45 pages becomes very, very important of this particular chapter 2, text number 2, that has been published by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Let us have this is the consolidation of international as well as the regional mechanism. But in the context of Africa alone, we are having at our disposal a very, very important convention. Twice I have already referred to this particular convention, but this is not the only convention, my dear friends. I am talking of 1969 OAU Convention. There are other important, instruments in the context of Africa which have exclusively been designed, devised for the protection of refugees in Africa. That is 1981 African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1981, which is also known as the Banjul Charter. It may be a question of what we call for civil services or for other important international services or international civil services. Then we are also having 1990 African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Again, we are having 1994 Addis Ababa document on refugees and forced population displacement in Africa that was concluded, I think, on 10th of December in 1994. We are also having, my dear friends, 1998 Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the establishment of an African Court on Human and People's Rights. We are also having another important arrangement that entered into and that was adopted in 2003 Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of women in Africa. We are also having, my dear friends, 2004 Cotonou Declaration and Program of Action. We are also having 2006 African Youth Charter, and that is very, very important, my dear friends. So far, youth problems are concerned in Africa continent as a regional, what we call, entity, a regional geopolitical entity. Now I take you to another important, what we call, continent, that is, America, or Americas rather, I should say, or the Pax Americana. In this particular, region, we are having 1928 Convention on Asylum. We are also having 1933 Convention on Political Asylum. We are also having 1939 Treaty on Political Asylum and Refugee, or Refuge, you may call it, and 54 Convention on Diplomatic Asylum, 1954 again the Convention on Territorial Asylum, and we are also having 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, and again 1989 Principles and Criteria for the Protection of and Assistance to what we call Central American refugees, returnees, and displaced what we call populations or persons in Latin America. Again, we are also blessed, my dear friends, 1991 International Conference on Central American refugees, the 1992 International Conference on Central American Refugees, again 1994 San Jose Declaration on Refugees and Displaced Persons. Then we are also having 2000 recommendations, my dear friends, if I am correct, in my submissions, particularly of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, particularly relating to asylum and international crimes. Then we are also having 2000 Rio de Janeiro what we call Declaration on the Institution of Refuge, and 2004 Mexico Declaration and Plans of Action to strengthen the international protection of refugees, particularly in American nation states. In case of Arab world, we are having plenty of instruments, and Arab world has not been far behind in crystallizing its resolve to protect refugees, but the institutionalization has always lacking the political what we call will, and therefore there is no dearth of what we call of international conventions or the regional what we call instruments. I can name some of the important and prominent what we call instruments which have been adopted on for the protection of refugees in this particular part of the world, and that is the Arab world. This reminds me of a 1949 assistance to Palestine refugees. This is exclusively based on the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 302, and that is a very, very important what we call resolution that was adopted under the auspices of the United Nations General Assembly in 1949. Then there is another important one, that is the 1965 protocol on the treatment of Palestinian refugees. Then we are also having, my dear friends, 1983, yes, it is 1983 Riyadh Arab Agreement on Judicial Cooperation, particularly relating to the organized crimes as well as the refugee problems. The 1981 Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights cannot be forgotten. The 1984 first what we call seminar of Arab experts on asylum and refugee law that has also taken place, and whatever the consensus emerged out of this seminar, that was also become the part of the international instruments, particularly in the context of what we call of Arab world. And at the same time, even the Arab nation states have also adopted the guidelines, the recommendations of this particular seminar. Then we are also having 1989 second seminar at particularly of Arab experts on asylum and refugee law. And then in the subsequent years, in 1990, Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam was also adopted. Then third seminar was also again organized in 1991. Then in 1992, fourth seminar was also adopted by the Arab nation states for the protection of what we call of refugees in this particular part of the world. Then 1990, for Arab Charter, my dear friends, on human rights becomes very important. Again, of the same year, 1994, Arab Convention on regulating status of refugees in the Arab countries. Then 2005 Covenant on the Rights of the Child in Islam, that was also adopted for the Arab nation states. If you take into account two important what we call regions of the world, and that is Asia, Africa, we are having the 2001 final text of the revised ALCO 1966 Bangkok Principles on Status and Treatment of what we call of refugees, and that was adopted at its what we call 40th session, if I am not wrong, at New Delhi in India. Again, we are also having 2006 ALCO resolution on legal identity and statelessness of that was adopted, I think, in the month of April in 2006. Again, in European nation states, my dear friends, we are also having, as I have already submitted, some of the important what we call conventions. Those conventions should not be forgotten. Then, my dear friends, on the basis of these frameworks, on the basis of these cumulative impact of these frameworks, and I am not at all undermining, my dear friends, and this is not sufficient. Remember one thing, I have simply submitted very prominent what we call regional legal binding, what we call legally binding frameworks for your consideration, but it does not mean, my dear friends, I have covered each and every aspect. There are some other important instruments, some other important legally binding frameworks which I am not in a position right now to enumerate in a very short period of time, but in due course of my submissions, I would also be invoking the rest of the regional conventions, instruments, covenants for the protection of refugees. But there are certain important questions, and we have to answer those very questions. Questions like, and before asking a question, we are going to have some kind of a comparative understanding as well. Suppose both the US and European states face a filtering challenge at their borders. And that is resulting from the conflict between facilitating trade and controlling unwanted what we call migrations. And you can understand the current situation with which the European nation states have been grappling with. I'm sorry. Then there is a question. Do they offer the bona fide asylum seeker equal chance of effective protection? What are the most significant differences between the US orientation of refugee protection at regional level as per the decisions which have been adjudicated by the European Commission on Human Rights or the European or your Inter-American Court of Human Rights? That should be taken into consideration. Another important aspect that I should share with all of you, my dear friends, as European integration proceeds, which aspects of the border control have been decoupled from individual states? Which aspects have been jealously guarded by states in Europe? Is a free movement within the European Union compatible with current European refugee policy? It's $1 million question, my dear friends. What are the differences between the refugees and asylees in the United States of America's policy formulation? What procedures apply to each what you call group? Do foreign policy considerations still affect US refugee policy and practice? We have to understand, my dear friends, these intra fragmentation, and these intra fragmentation ramifications on refugee policy has also attained some crisis proportions, and they are having the different and double standards so far the refugee policies are concerned at international level. Do the US and the European asylum systems offer both bona fide asylum seeker equal chances of effective protection? What are the most significant differences we have to identify? On current trends, does it appear as if the US is following the European lead or vice versa? What exactly are the compatible, I mean, goalposts? What does integration of migrants and refugees, my dear friends, mean? And what specific measures have been entered to facilitate their integration? What public policies have been put into place to govern refugees and migrants or their social welfare and integration? What challenges and what exactly are the challenges which we find that they have been existing or are in existence? What are the gains and the losses of the two different what you call approaches? One is adopted by the European Union, and another one is adopted by the US. Has the idealism of the OAU convention been implemented in current what we call practice? How to locate the idealism that is away from the realism of the refugee protection, and how it has been argued before the African Court of Human Rights that has been established, or before the African Commission on Human Rights, and what exactly has been the stand of African Union? Therefore we have to examine, my dear friends, the working definition of some of the important aspects, particularly of IDPs, how they have been protected at regional level, and what attempts have been made by the nation states to accommodate their concerns within all the regions around the world. And we have to understand sovereignty, idea of sovereignty, and how idea of sovereignty has been presented as a responsibility. When does international responsibility displace state sovereignty? We have to locate those very situations, and what are the principal differences between the 1951 convention and the OAU convention at African level? Because 1951 convention, my dear friends, presents a very important aspect, and that aspect is that it is basically a Eurocentric what you call convention, as it is generally alleged by the rest of the particularly developing nations scholarships. That is one argument. Another important argument, my dear friends, that is presented, and I must present for your consideration. Then how does 1951 convention differs from the OAU convention of 1969 that is designed to govern specific aspects of refugees in Africa? So what is the difference between the two? Because one is representing entire global north jurisdictions, and another one is, the African what we call OAU convention, or OAU convention of 1969 is governing the global south nation states, and the South Asian scholarship has also sided with 1969 OAU convention on the specific aspects of governing the specific aspects of refugees in Africa. So this discernible difference, this particular conspicuous distinction, we have to, my dear friends, critically appreciate while understanding what are the protections which have been designed for refugees in these two important what we call regions of the world, the global south and the global north. And at the same time, how should a relatively prosperous state like South Africa in the Africa continent approach the question of group what we call eligibility for asylum, given the scale and the what we call, not only the scale, but given the enormity of African what we call problems that we have to understand. What is the current scenario? What is the current scenario in Europe so far the refugees are concerned? Do you have any take? Yes, anybody, you're most welcome to contribute. Let me fetch a glass of water. Yes, brother. Tell me. What do you feel? I'm sorry. My dear friends, if you have an understanding or you are going to understand the current situation of the current refugee scenario, then last 7 years becomes very, very important in the context of Europe. Because in 6 or 7 years' time, since the European Union turned to Turkey to keep asylum seekers and other migrants from reaching European soil, in exchange for a variety of economic and other considerations, governments around the world have increasingly externalized their migration controls and asylum proceedings. That is one important understanding. Second, they have done so by pushing their borders outward through arrangements with the transit and origin countries, as well as by implementing barriers that make it harder to access protection. And this pitch has also been further quelled due to certain global developments like pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these challenges by providing a public health what you call rationale for border closures and entry limitations. These 6 or 7 years, my dear friends, or the 7th anniversary of the EU-Turkey deal provided an opportunity to examine these implications, these ramifications. Because the very first important question that has to be examined, my dear friends, is how the accessibility of asylum and protection globally has changed. To what extent, my dear friends, the externalization strategies such as the EU-Turkey agreement or deals with Libya and now rescinded US agreements to send asylum seekers to Central America have become the dominant strategies deployed by countries of asylum. In my recent blog, I have also pointed out these important challenges that we have been confronting restrictionism in Europe, and there is a weakening of the doctrine of non-refoulement by the very countries who have coined this particular doctrine and incorporated under Article 33 sub clause 1 of 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. Very country have been violating. Those who were favored this doctrine, now they have been what you call violating its contours, its spirit, its ethos, its trust, and its moral authority. Therefore, these questions we have been grappling with. How have the impact of what you call of these policies been felt, both by the asylum seekers and the host and the transit what you call nation states, and what can be done, my dear friends, to ensure refugee continue to have access to protection and asylum procedures? Is there any need to launch a new initiative beyond territorial asylum, making protection work in a bordered world? That has to be taken into consideration. And this must also be, addressed as well, because there is a question how to redesign the global protection and resettlement infrastructure in a way that is more equitable, flexible, and sustainable under this new initiative that is likely to be what you call taken, and what kind of arrangements have been there. We have to address these challenges, and the very first important idea that comes to my mind is that we have to create an environment in which the refugees or the refugee congenial or refugee friendly atmosphere must be created, or refugee conducive conditions must also be emplaced. And this is the responsibility not only of the regions of the nation states, but at the same time this is the responsibility of international community of nation states who have been claiming themselves to be the part of the civilization of the civilized community of nation states. And that is why, my dear friends, in recent years, particularly in 2018, as I have submitted in the last week as well as yesterday, that the Global Compact has ultimately presented the new what we call notions of civility. So far, the role of the international community, the role of the international organizations like International Organization for Migration, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and other important stakeholders and civil society institutions as well for the protection of refugees. So cumulatively speaking, it becomes very, very important and necessary, my dear friends, in the current what we call context, that a favorable protection environment has to be there, because in a favorable protection environment, my dear friends, refugees and asylum seekers are admitted and protected against a very, very important what we call crime, and that is refoulement. So non-refoulement has to be protected under all circumstances. A favorable protection environment is also important, and that causes and demographies, I should say, of displacement are well known. The rights of the refugees and other asylum seekers are recognized in the national law if we are having a favorable what we call protection environment for refugees. Administrative capacity to oversee affairs regarding refugee and asylum seekers is to be made adequate, and there, I mean, the capacity building must be addressed if we have to create a favorable protection environment for the refugees, because the protection issues are addressed by all relevant stakeholders. The local population are receptive to refugees and asylum seekers. The environmental impact at the same time is very, very what we call limited if these efforts are undertaken by all the stakeholders collectively, and the needs and potential contributions of the refugees and asylum seekers must be acknowledged and form part of the national and regional development strategies. Then only we can create a favorable protection environment for the refugees integration, for the refugees resettlement, for the refugees repatriation, if that is likely to happen. But repatriation must be voluntary, and we must locate the voluntary character of the repatriation, particularly under customary international law. So that becomes very, very significant, my dear friends, in the current what we call environments, because it is important that the refugee friendly environment must be created, but at the same time the contributions of the refugees must also be appreciated. Because I am of the view, in my personal opinion, and it's a well considered opinion, my dear friends, that I feel the refugees should not be taken as burden. Refugees should not be what we call taken as a additional responsibility. Rather, refugees should be taken as a resource. A resource that must be what we call oriented for the nation building. Nation building in the context of the country of reception. The refugees must be addressed as an asset, not as a burden, not as a responsibility, but their services, their skill, their what we call dexterity, their what we call hard work, and their specializations in different disciplines must also be acknowledged and utilized optimally in the nation building, in the country of what you call of arrivals, in the country of reception, in the country of destination. So this is how we can strengthen and create a favorable protection environment. So then let us begin our understanding of refugee reception in Europe. What do you mean by Europe? Mr. Rom, would you like to give some respite to my vocal cords, my dear friend? I need a 1 minute break to give some reprieve, to give some respite to my vocal cords, and you should utilize this 1 minute. So, what is your understanding of Europe? If further I ask you, what is your understanding of SARC? What is SARC? On the same, similarly, I am asking this question: what is Europe? Anyway, let me respond to my question. My dear friends, when we are talking of Europe, then a geopolitical identity comes and appears in our mind. There is no one definition of Europe. When we are talking of Europe, because when we are going to talk of the European, I mean the protection of refugees in Europe, we should first understand what is Europe. My dear friends, Europe stretches from the Aleutian Islands to the Aleutian Islands. As the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is popularly in abbreviated form known as OSCE, that includes both the Russian Federation and the United States among its participating states. It also includes the 5 Central Asian republics. While geographers have been what you call categorized, or have never been what you call categorical, it is usually stated, my dear friends, that the eastern borders is the Ural Mountains. Ural Mountains in Russia, and its southern border is found by, or what you call formed by the Mediterranean in the west. And it is very, very important to understand at this stage, my dear friends, deliberately I am making this presentation before you, because we have to understand the Ukrainian war, or the war between Ukraine and Russia. Because the biggest what we call result of this particular war has been the emergence of the new refugee groups. And there are as many as of now, more than 4 million refugees are there in the bordering states, in the neighboring states of Ukraine. And lot of casualties, death and destruction and devastation we have been witnessing. But so far Europe is concerned, my dear friends, there may have been some dispute with respect to the caucasian in the past, or this particular Caucasus region is concerned. European Union, my dear friends, in the 20th century was seen as a Western European organization, but it also included countries like Finland. In the 21st century, it is moving eastward and will include Turkey as well. But that is a political what you call question, and I don't want to answer at this stage, because Turkey is facing lot of discrimination so far its incorporation in this geopolitical entity is concerned. However, the Council of Europe was also seen as Western, but this has included Turkey since its inception. A state that saddles, my dear, and at the same time straddles, I should say, both Europe and Asia since the 90s. The Council of Europe, my dear friends, has moved eastward. And at the same time, the states of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, have also become the members of what we call of the Council of Europe. If nothing is clear in this particular geopolitical morass, Europe is not easy to define. It is very difficult to define. On this particular premise, it is difficult to see how one can speak of a European instance on international law. That is particularly true in relation to refugee law or international refugee law. Indeed, some European states are source states, some European states are transit states, and some states, European states, are destination, what we call states. But here lies another important what we call question, and that question is relating to, my dear friends, to certain important premises. When we are talking of the premises, particularly the premises of the European values, how European values have been impacting, addressing, responding to refugee crisis, then very short three questions comes to my mind. What are the European values? What are the European challenges? And what are the or what is the crisis? Or if I am using the plural, the world crisis in the plural sense, it is spelling what we call differs. It is now, I should say, what are the crises? I mean CRISES, not SIS. It is plural now. So what are the European crises? So what is your understanding when we are talking of what are the European values? So how do you understand that this is the manifestations, or one of the manifestations of the European values? Anybody? What do you mean by European values? Mr. Anup Kumar, what is your understanding of the European values? Well, my dear friends, since charity begins at home, I should come out and try to apprise you about the South Asian values, which have been presented to all of us, including you, as the idea of South Asianness, as the narrative of regional consciousness. These are the two important narratives which crystallize the entire philosophy, entire understanding, entire ethos behind the establishment of an intergovernmental organizations, which is today known as the South Asian University, where we are going to foster, propagate a new culture of work, and that must be reflected in the conduct of the new generation of students and new generations of scholars, experts, advocates, social scientists, academics, professors, lawyers, judges, advocates, and we have been creating a new generation of South Asians, and they are going to represent cumulatively in their respective what we call country of origins, the cumulative or the combined values which have been inculcated in their personalities during their student days in this institution. So we have been talking of democracy, we have been talking of rule of law, we have been talking of social justice, We have been talking of coexistence. We have been talking of cultural harmony. We have been talking of composite culture in our nation states. We have been talking of multiculturalism. We are talking of diversity, and we have been talking of pluralism in all the South Asian jurisdictions. So these are the South Asian values of today. Likewise, my dear friends, or similarly, when we are talking of the European values and how these European values are going or likely to be appropriated for the resolution or for addressing asylum, what we call crisis in Europe, then we must what we call have, and we must try to have a fair idea of European values. Then in Europe, as European people have been claiming, my dear friends, liberal, democratic, and human rights based what we call approaches are considered to be the values emanating from European life. Neutrality and universality of the liberal model of governance has always been advocated by the European stakeholders as their value. Liberal universalist values for asylum and immigration, that has also been what we call the hallmark of European life. Advocate scope for cultural diversity has always been at the forefront in European what we call nation states. However, there have been debates, and I'm not denying those very debates on the integration of immigrants, but recognition of problems of the socio-economic inequalities between different ethnic groups in Europe have also been recognized. But these European values have also been confronting with certain important challenges, particularly after the influx of refugees in many of the European nation states. Then what is the or rather I should say, what are the challenges? My dear friend, the challenges are the contemporary problems of the multicultural European states. Practical feasibility of the liberal universality model happens to be in crisis. Doubts about the practical adequacy of this particular model is being felt by the stakeholders, and the challenge to European liberal values has presented because we have been witnessing among the refugees coming from Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, and they are flooding some of the European nation states, and they are presenting a challenge of radicalization, the challenge of terrorism, the challenge of very restrictive what we call of the Islamically oriented values, which have further what we call presented new challenges to the European nation states. And the question on the ability of the liberal democratic states have been what we call in jeopardy. And again, at the same time, my dear friends, Europe's self-identity as the prophet of liberal human rights values order has been or has become what we call questionable, and there happens to be a reassertion of the fundamental liberal values on the part of the many of the European nation states that has become. And I can give you certain important examples. Examples like, my dear friends, in the month of April 2018, my dear friends, a car ramming was thwarted by police in Naples after the arrest of a man of Gambian origins. He pledged allegiance to the Islamic State leader. You can recall these kinds of incidents that has presented a challenge so far the liberal democratic order of Europe is concerned. I can give you further example. In the same month of the same year, that is the April 2018, a 46-year-old man who had arrived as a refugee from Uzbekistan was arrested when police what he called searched and found explosives on his what he called property. Again, in the month of March in 2019, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for planning a terrorist attack in Sweden in the name of Islamic State and financing serious what he called crime. He was also given a deportation order and a ban from returning to Sweden again. And 4 other men were also sentenced for falsifying documents or financing serious crime and received prison sentences ranging from 1 to 6 months in prison. There is no dearth of examples. What happened? in 2017, a man driving a van rammed pedestrians on the London Bridge and drove to nearby what you call Borough Market, where three men went on a stabbing rampage. 7 people died and 48 others were injured. Police shot dead all three what you call attackers. So there is no dearth of what you call such kind of an example that has these incidents of recent origin have also presented the biggest challenge so far the liberal democratic universalist model of governance, accountability, transparency in Europe is concerned, and this is how they understand that these are the European values. Because terrorism is a very very important segment, a very important segment that has presented challenges, crisis, and that has also questioned the idea of protection of ordinary refugees. This reminds me of another important incident of 2017. If you recall, my dear friends, a lone suicide bomber struck at an Ariana Grande pop concert in Manchester. And as the spectator, what you call, fled out of the arena, the attacker killed, my dear friends, as many as 22 people, many of them children, and injured dozens of people. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for this attack as well. In the same year, my dear friends, again in the month of April, a man plowed a truck into shoppers at a departmental store in Stockholm, Sweden, killing 5 people and injuring at least 10 persons. So there is no dearth of what you call. I can make a presentation of the entire chronology of events which ultimately weakened in the larger what you call context, my dear friends. It had these kinds of incidents ultimately what you call weakened the entire institution of asylum of a liberal what you call model. And that is why today we have been what you call facing restrictionism and the weakening of the doctrine of non-refoulement in entire Europe. So this is very, very important, my dear friends, because actions of refugees or actions of people in the garb of refugees have ultimately weakened the cause of refugees. Then that is why it has become a crisis. Crisis of multiple manifestations. Today, that is why, my dear friends, today it has become utterly banal, I should say, to speak of the crisis in Europe, even as there were, rather, I should say, have proliferated invocations of a veritable crisis of Europe, a putative crisis of the very idea of Europe. New keywords are emerging, my dear friends, in the lexicon of protection crisis. The crisis in and of what you call of Europe was initiated in the immediate aftermath or the Charlie Hebdo what you call shootings, and that happened in France, in Paris. This is an incident, if you recall, of the 2015, and the same has been brought to a necessarily tentative and only partial what you call completion in the aftermath of the subsequent massacres in Paris in the month of November, I think in 2015 again. The spectacles of the terror and security, awkwardly, my dear friends, seem to frame what otherwise during the what you call intervening several months has been represented as the migrant crisis or the refugee crisis, or more broadly speaking, a crisis of the borders of Europe. The protracted and enduring ramifications of the global economic crisis and the concomitant policies of the austerity have already been a kind of fixture of European and social and political life. The events in Paris, my dear friends, has ultimately left an indelible scar. And these, events in Paris are simply the most recent and most what you call hyper-mediated occasions for a re-intensifications of the ongoing processes of securitization that have been persistent, if inconsistent, mandate of the putative global war on terror. That should be understood, because ultimately we, the people from the global south nation states, are suffering from or fleeing persecution in our countries of origin, has ultimately weakened the European idea of what we call of asylum. We have weakened the institution of what we call non reforma. So refugees are equally responsible in the country of reception what for their what we call actions, how they have perceived this particular idea, and how, what kind of a behavior has been of refugees towards their countries of reception and their authorities. An acute sense of necessity of rethinking the conceptual, I should say, and discursive categories that govern borders, migration, and asylum, and simultaneously overshadow how scholarship and research on these topics commonly come to recapitulate both the dominant discourses and re-vivify them. That must also be taken into consideration. Transversal reality of the multiple crises that coexist alongside the purported migration or refugee crisis, and particularly in the European peninsula, has presented enormous what you call challenges. How may the crisis associated with border control and asylum and immigration law enforcement be apprehensible as what we call co-constitutive of what is otherwise so ubiquitously known simply as the crisis? The economic crisis, we may call it, as well as the related crisis of Europe itself, or the political, juridical, or institutional crisis of the European Union, and particularly such European institutions as the Schengen zone of the passport free travel that has reconfigured the borders of Europe by sustaining an internal space, or relatively speaking, albeit differently, free what we call human mobility, that has also been curtailed and restricted because of the behavior of refugees. And this critical angle, my dear friends, of vision on the crisis in and of Europe must be further situated within the context of what we call of our global historical moment. And what is that? That is, my dear friends, the recent and the ongoing proliferation of wars, civil wars, military interventions, and neo-colonial occupations across the planet, in which European powers have been, or are, and have been, or long been, my dear friends, profoundly particularly in, rather I should say, framed, implicated, and they have been acquiesced. This particular perspective illuminates the dire necessity of radically unsettling any self-satisfied European discourse on migration or refugees as the de facto human refuge of crisis, constructed to be strictly external to the presumed safety and stability of Europe, erupting always elsewhere. So that has to be taken into consideration. Or let me put it in other words, my dear friends. Starting from the dramatic increase in the number of people seeking asylum in Europe because of the violent convulsions and disruptions of war, but also in the light of the preemptive, unfavorably, or unavailability of any other what we call route for migration to Europe for the vast majority of the world populations. What is at stake in this particular situation or here is a rigorously post-colonial critique of the governmentality of migration and asylum, and the misleading opposition between the genuine or the legitimate refugees and ostensibly economic migrants. That must be identified. These contrivances, my dear friends, of the global government of the human mobility intersect sustainability with the analytical categories that discipline academic research and scholarship. How these manifold and interconnected crisis might signal a larger epistemic, rather I should say, crisis regarding some of the central and defining categories of thought and action surrounding the contemporary, what we call contemporary, post-colonial, post-Cold War, or neoliberal, what we call constitution of a place called what we call Europe. that has to be addressed. My dear friends, in the wake of the European values and the asylum crisis, what we have identified, what should be our takeaway out of this these deliberations, there happens to be a deep-seated anxiety at the growth in support for the far-right movements in many of the European geopolitical entities or European political setups. That is one challenge. Another important challenge which we have been witnessing, and I hope you would concur with me, that there happens to be a resurgence of exclusionary forms of nationalism and ethnocentrism in Europe. The third important challenge that I am worried about is that there is a rising racist and anti-immigration sentiment in many European countries. We have also been witnessing a strong backlash against asylum applicants. And it has been resulting in the increasingly restrictive measures by the European nation states in the form of what we call the carrier sanctions for airlines, accelerated asylum procedures. Third countries are inconsistent with the standards of international refugee protection. This is what we have been witnessing. There is a necessity, my dear friends, that a liberal understanding of the refugee regime is crumbling down. And there is a necessity to reverse this particular trend. Another important challenge, why I am saying this, because there is a challenge, and that is replacement of the post-war liberal refugee regime with a more restrictive quota-based system or other measures to contain refugee flows in countries of origin. This is what we have been witnessing. And important implications for conceptions of the European identity, responses to the asylum crisis, and the implications for the European values have presented the biggest challenges in the existential history of the European what we call nation states. Then there is another important organization, Council of Europe. You might have heard this particular what we call a regional body, and that is the Council of Europe. So we have to understand the Council of Europe and its what we call role in refugee protection, and that becomes equally important if we have to understand the regional implications of the refugee protection. We have already witnessed and tried to define what is the definition of Europe for any discussion of the international protection of refugees, given that wording, my dear friends, of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees as originally drafted only applied to people fleeing persecution in Europe immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War. But you already understand how this particular 1951 Convention has been made universal by adopting an international what we call framework, international additional protocol that ultimately made it universal. But at this stage, we have to understand, my dear friends, European legal and policy framework for refugee protection. It is important to understand the entire what we call European legal and policy framework for refugee protection to guarantee the protection of refugees. My dear friends, as it is axiomatic from our definitional dilemma, our definitional ambivalence, that the Europe is somewhat indeterminate as a legal concept. And with respect to refugee law, the European Union is the major actor in the region. Although the Council of Europe provides a protection guarantees for many people who fall to obtain refugee status, consequent on the restrictive approach taken in EU member states. In 2001, my dear friends, European Union finally produced the harmonized policies on qualification for refugee status or subsidiary protection and on minimum procedures throughout the 25 or called for in 1997 Treaty of Amsterdam, you may call it. This treaty has also presented, my dear friends, a cumulative protection shield. The principal criticism of the approach of the European Union towards the refugees is that it has combined asylum with immigration. Immigration law is about controlling entry, my dear friends, whereas international refugee law is about providing international protection. And there should not be any kind of a confusion on this particular, understanding. This has to be understood in the very crystallized form. The absence of a supervisory tribunal to oversee the application of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees with its additional protocol of 1967 has meant that states have developed their interpretations of the refugee law independently. Harmonizations, on the other hand, my dear friends, inevitably leads to equalizing down at the expense of the refugee when it is attempted to attune those independent approaches. Taken together, my dear friends, or putting together with the link to migration, particularly irregular migration, the focus within the European Union on numbers and on so-called bogus asylum seekers. There is another important, problem of the bogus, asylum seekers. With an immigration control mentality driving refugee policy, it is little wonder that the approach of the European Union has consisted in part of measures designed to move decision making to the third what we call states. So this approach of the European Union must be understood. And what is that approach, my dear friends? As I have already submitted, and it is the most basic, fundamental, and rudimentary criticism of the approach that has been undertaken by the European Union towards refugees is that it has, my dear friends, clubbed asylum with immigration. Immigration law, as I have told you, it basically controls entry, whereas, or on the other hand, refugee law generally extends international protection. Since 1980s, refugee policy has been seen as a specialized branch of immigration policy, particularly in European nation states. European Union's internal borders policy lead to greater what we call restrictions at the external borders, which inevitably impacted upon applicants for refugee status. At one level, my dear friends, refugee law since 1945 has been a part of attempts by states to regulate the movements of the people across borders, trying to deal with the migration and refugee status through resettlement programs for a few skilled workers from amongst those displaced, denying the country of origin their expertise if repatriation became possible at some point in the future. Europe would take the doctors and engineers, not the unskilled manual laborers. But surreptitiously, my dear friends, in recent what we call years, particularly if you take into account the last decade, we have witnessed that the people from Bangladesh surreptitiously, illegally entered into what we call in Germany and some of the European nations, and particularly in case of Germany, and the landlord community in Germany employed them as what we call farm laborers in the rural areas, and they have been hidden. They have been what we call away from the law enforcement agencies of Germany. This has been the and trained, and at the same time some of the laborers have also got in the subsequent or after spending significant amount of years in Germany, they managed ultimately to have the German citizenship. So this has further what we call and enticed, allured the rest of the family members in Bangladesh. So we find these kinds of what you call instances, and some other what you call from even Sri Lanka. We also find these kinds of instances. So far, the farm what you call sector in Germany is concerned, because the cheap farm labor has always been a dream of the European nation states, and the refugee status, my dear friends, in this particular context, it should be about protecting individuals regardless of their what you call qualifications. This is what some of the lawyers have always been what you call arguing. So let us try to understand, my dear friends, EU policies, particularly on the issue of asylum. You understand what is asylum and how asylum has been treated, how the institution of asylum has been weakened, how the institution of asylum in certain situations is strengthened, how the people felt themselves to be or highly empowered when the asylum system protected them in hostile environments, in inimical what we call environments. So if we have to understand, my dear friends, European Union's approach, or European Union what we call take on asylum policies, or European asylum policies, it is important to understand that the EU is one of the central players in the international community in terms of migration and asylum legislation and policies. My dear friends, today the European Union is consisting of 27 nation states. That is forming the part of the European Union. But it does not mean that entire Europe is having only 27 states. And recently, during the Brexit, when the Brexit proceedings have completed under the Lisbon Treaty under Article 50, now the European Union is consisting of, after the departure of the United Kingdom, it is consisting of only of the 27 states. But this is not the entire Europe. You will find that there are as many as, my dear friends, 47 nation states in entire what we call Europe. And these 40 nation states of Europe are consisting of entire European peninsula. And this particular region of the world is having different legislations, different what we call treatments, and people are also reaching and approaching even those European nation states who are not the part of the European Union. But as a political bloc, Europe is calling the shots in the corridors of the international power structures, and that is why European Union as a political identity, European Union as a political collectivity, as a political or geopolitical alliance, that is influencing international refugee law as well as the refugee policies. So therefore, we have to be very careful, and we have to very cautiously understand what exactly has been the European Union policies or asylum policies. In this background, we have to understand the last few years, my dear friends, have also seen the resurgence of the emigration, not immigration, my dear friends, emigration flows from some EU member states into other countries and regions in the world. And this is coupled with the creation of an internal market where the free movement of European citizens is ensured, and the establishment of an area of freedom, area of security, area of justice, whose external borders are jointly controlled, that has been established. Decreasing opportunities for legal migration and increasing what you call economic and security complications and considerations in countries of origin often force people to migrate irregularly, and often ending up being victims of exploitations for labor or for prostitutions. And they also become the part, and they are also what you call trapped in the tentacles of what you call of human trafficking syndicates. My dear friends, there is a high demand for low skilled, low cost labor in the global north. And it is also, coupled with the well established informed labor practices in the destination and transit countries. And there is also a bad information about illegal migration channels. Particularly, these migration channels have finished the equation that benefit smuggling and trafficking or human trafficking networks. A number of complex policies and legislation have been adopted in order to address these trends and phenomenon while cooperating with the third countries in the area or areas of migration and asylum. People living and working outside European Union, my dear friends, understanding its migration system can be a too important and one of the most important challenge. But when we are talking of policies, because I generally have never been in favor of policies, because the policies must have some kind of a legal background, the legal foundation. Policies are designed exclusively on the basis of the administrative whims and maxims, or at the fine dictate and at the expense of political governance institutions, that policy remains volatile, and that policy cannot be what we call relied upon for stability, perpetuity, peace, and public order. Therefore, policy is a very dangerous territory, and sometimes we also confront a policy terra incognita in many of the situations. Therefore, my dear friends, when we are talking of policies, it is necessary to understand that an integrated approach to the protection of refugees across the European Union required. If that unification of policy, that integrated approach is reflected in the policy, I can give you some of the important examples how these kinds of attempts have been made by the European nation states. In 1999, my dear friends, European Union heads of state and government meeting in Tampere called for the establishment of a common European asylum system. And this common European asylum system, which is in abbreviated form popularly known as CEAS, CEAS. Since then, asylum has been considered an issue to be talked at European Union level. Many legislative measures were taken, my dear friends, at the European Union level between 1999 and 2005, regulating some aspects of the important issues like asylum procedures, reception conditions for asylum seekers, responsibility for examining an asylum application, and qualification to become a refugee, and so on and so forth. European Council, my dear friends, requested in the Hague program further, it has requested that there has to be a further development of the common European asylum policy or asylum system. And therefore, in 2007, my dear friends, the Commission presented, European Commission I am talking of, European Commission presented a green paper to launch a debate with all relevant actors about the form, about the manner, about the potential visage of the common European asylum system should take, and input received during this debate contributed to the preparation of the European Union asylum policy plan. And what has been the plan? What has been the purpose of this policy plan? That has to be understood, my dear friends. And I will definitely on the next occasion I will crystallize what kind of a purpose of this plan has been, what we call there, and we will further proceed from this particular point. Meanwhile, you can Email me your questions, your other important what you call manifestations which you feel regarding today's deliberations. Your understandings, your observations, your comments are most welcome. Thank you very much for the day. And I'm immensely thankful to my friends who have joined to and participated in today's deliberations. Yes, I welcome Miss Padmaja. How are you? I hope you are fine. After a very long time, you have joined. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Hutt. Thank you, Mr. Ismail. Thanks a lot for joining today's deliberations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You're, you're, thanks a lot. Bye bye. Take care.